It was supposed to be an ordinary school day at Lincoln High. The hallways buzzed with students rushing to their next classes, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Mrs. Carter, an English teacher known for her keen attention to her students, had just stepped out for a short break when she heard something unusual, a faint, muffled cry coming from the girls' restroom. At first, she thought it was just another student skipping class, but as she pushed open the door, her heart pounded. Inside, huddled in the corner of a stall, was a young girl, pale, trembling, and drenched in sweat, and in her arms, a tiny newborn baby. Mrs. Carter froze. 1,000 questions flooded her mind, but one thing was immediately clear. This was no ordinary teenage pregnancy. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Mrs. Carter's breath caught in her throat as she took a step closer. The girl, Madison, one of her quieter students, looked up with wide, terrified eyes. Tears streaked down her pale cheeks, her body trembling as she clutched the fragile newborn against her chest. The baby's tiny cries echoed off the tiled walls, a sound so fragile yet piercing that it sent chills down Mrs. Carter's spine. "Madison," she whispered, her voice gentle but urgent. "It's okay. You're safe. We need to get you help." Madison shook her head frantically, her arms tightening protectively around the infant. "No," she choked out. "Please, no hospitals. No police." Mrs. Carter hesitated. Every instinct told her to call for an ambulance, but the raw fear in Madison's eyes made her pause. This wasn't just about a teenage girl hiding an unexpected pregnancy. There was something much darker beneath the surface. The door creaked open behind them, and another teacher peeked in. "Everything okay, Mrs. Carter?" Thinking fast, Mrs. Carter nodded, stepping slightly to block the stall. "I've got this," she said, forcing a reassuring smile. "Could you just grab the nurse for me? Tell her it's urgent, but keep it discreet." As the other teacher left, Mrs. Carter knelt beside Madison, her voice low. "Madison, I need you to trust me. Whatever happened, whatever you're afraid of, you don't have to handle it alone." Madison swallowed hard, her lips trembling. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If they find out, they'll kill me." The words sent ice through Mrs. Carter's veins. "Who, Madison?" she asked carefully. Madison shook her head again, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "My parents. They can't know. They can't know the baby is alive." Mrs. Carter's stomach twisted. She had taught Madison for nearly a year, always noticing how quiet and withdrawn she was. But she had never imagined this. Just then, the baby let out another weak cry, its tiny fingers twitching against Madison's skin. Mrs. Carter made a decision. "Listen to me," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I am not going to let anything happen to you or this baby, but I need to know the truth. Whatever you're hiding from, whoever you're afraid of, we can find a way to keep you safe." Madison hesitated, her body still tense. But as she looked down at the fragile life in her arms, something in her broke. A sob escaped her lips, and she whispered words that made Mrs. Carter's blood run cold. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. They were going to take the baby as soon as I gave birth. I wasn't even supposed to see her." Mrs. Carter's hands clenched. "Who, Madison?" she pressed. Madison looked up, her face pale as death. "My parents," she breathed. "They sold my baby before she was even born." Mrs. Carter felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Sold? The word echoed in her mind, foreign and impossible. Yet the raw terror in Madison's eyes made it undeniable. She forced herself to stay calm. The girl before her had just given birth, and she was clearly in danger. Reacting with shock or anger wouldn't help. "Madison," she said gently, "I need you to tell me everything. Who did they sell your baby to?" Madison swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she cradled the newborn girl against her chest. I don't know exactly," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "They said they made a deal, that she'd go to a better home, that I wouldn't even have to see her. But I heard them talking late at night, making plans, and I know it wasn't an adoption." Mrs. Carter felt a chill creep up her spine. This wasn't just a case of cruel parents forcing their daughter into secrecy. This was human trafficking. A sudden noise in the hallway made Madison flinch. She looked at Mrs. Carter, eyes pleading. "Please," she begged, "don't let them take her. They'll come for me. I know they will." Mrs. Carter clenched her jaw. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Just then, the door to the restroom swung open again, and the school nurse, Mrs. Holloway, stepped inside. She took one look at the situation and immediately sprang into action, her years of experience taking over. "She needs medical attention," Mrs. Holloway said firmly. "Both of them do. We need to get them to a hospital." Madison stiffened. "No, they'll find me. Please, you don't understand." Mrs. Carter put a reassuring hand on Madison's shoulder. "What if we don't take you to a regular hospital?" she suggested. "What if we find somewhere safe? Somewhere your parents won't know to look?" Madison's lip quivered. "Is that even possible?" Mrs. Carter exchanged a look with Mrs. Holloway. "It is," Mrs. Holloway said after a pause. "I know a women's shelter downtown. They work with survivors of abuse, no questions asked. They have doctors, social workers, and they won't tell anyone you're there unless you want them to." Madison hesitated. For the first time, a glimmer of hope flickered in her exhausted eyes. Mrs. Carter squeezed her hand. "Madison, you don't have to go back to them. You and your baby deserve better." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Madison gave a small, shaky nod. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll go." Relief flooded Mrs. Carter, but she knew this wasn't over yet. Madison's parents wouldn't just let her disappear. If they had already arranged to sell the baby, they would come looking for her, and for the newborn. As Mrs. Holloway carefully helped Madison to her feet, Mrs. Carter pulled out her phone. She wasn't sure what the right move was yet, but one thing was clear: she needed help. And if Madison's parents were involved in something this sinister, it was only a matter of time before the truth unraveled. And when it did, she would make sure they answered for their crimes. Mrs. Carter's hands trembled slightly as she dialed a number on her phone. She wasn't sure if this was the right decision, but she couldn't risk waiting any longer. "Detective Reynolds," a deep voice answered after the second ring. Mrs. Carter exhaled. "James, it's me, Emma Carter." There was a pause. "Emma? What's wrong?" "I need your help," she said, lowering her voice and stepping slightly away from Madison and Mrs. Holloway. "I have a student. She just gave birth in the school bathroom. She says her parents were planning to sell the baby. I don't have all the details yet, but I know she's in danger. I need to get her somewhere safe, but I also need to make sure these people don't get away with whatever they're involved in." Another pause. Then Reynolds' voice turned sharp, all business. "Where are you now?" "At Lincoln High, second floor girls' restroom. We're about to take her to a women's shelter, but I don't know how much time we have before her parents realize what's happening." "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said. "Don't leave yet. If what she's saying is true, this is bigger than just a case of abuse. We might be dealing with a trafficking ring." Mrs. Carter's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stay steady. "Understood. Just hurry." She ended the call and turned back to Madison, who was watching her with nervous eyes. "I called someone I trust, a detective. He's going to help us." Madison flinched. "The police?" "I promise he's not like the others. He won't just send you back home." Mrs. Carter softened her voice. "Madison, you were so brave to tell me the truth. But if your parents are involved in something this serious, we need to stop them before they hurt someone else." Madison swallowed hard and nodded, though fear still lingered in her expression. Mrs. Holloway carefully wrapped the newborn in her sweater, whispering soft reassurances as she checked the baby's pulse and breathing. "She's small, but she's strong," she murmured. "She just needs warmth and some milk." At that moment, the restroom door swung open. Mrs. Carter's heart jumped. Had someone heard them? But it was only Principal Dawson, his face creased with confusion. "Emma, what's going on here?" His gaze landed on Madison, the baby in her arms, and his expression shifted from confusion to shock. "There's no time to explain everything," Mrs. Carter said quickly. "I need you to trust me. This is bigger than a school matter. A detective is on his way. But until then, I need you to make sure no one, not a single person, contacts Madison's parents." Dawson hesitated, looking between Mrs. Carter and the frightened girl. Then, to her relief, he gave a firm nod. "Whatever you need." Just then, Madison stiffened, her fingers clutching Mrs. Holloway's sweater. "They're here," she whispered. Mrs. Carter followed her gaze to the window. Outside, in the parking lot, a sleek black car had just pulled up. A man and a woman stepped out, both impeccably dressed, their expressions calm but cold. Madison's parents. Mrs. Carter's pulse pounded. They weren't panicking. They weren't rushing inside in search of their daughter. They looked patient, calculating, like they already knew she was still inside. Mrs. Carter glanced at her watch. Detective Reynolds was still 10 minutes away, but something told her they wouldn't wait that long. She turned back to Madison, speaking low but firm. "We're getting you out of here, right now." Madison's breath hitched. "But how?" Mrs. Carter's mind raced. Then she looked at Mrs. Holloway. "Can you take her out through the back entrance? Get her to your car." Mrs. Holloway nodded immediately. "I parked near the staff lot. It's hidden from the main road." Mrs. Carter turned to Dawson. "You need to stall them. Tell them you haven't seen Madison. Don't let them anywhere near this part of the building." Dawson inhaled deeply, then squared his shoulders. "Got it." Madison hesitated for only a second longer before gripping Mrs. Holloway's hand. "Okay, let's go." Mrs. Carter watched as the two women slipped quietly out the back door, the baby held tightly in Mrs. Holloway's arms. She exhaled sharply, turning back to the window just in time to see Madison's father glance at his watch, then exchange a brief nod with his wife. Then he pulled out his phone. Mrs. Carter didn't know who he was calling, but she knew one thing for sure. They weren't just parents looking for their daughter. They were criminals, and they were planning their next move. Mrs. Carter's heart pounded as she watched Madison's father put his phone to his ear. She didn't know who he was calling, but she knew it wasn't good. She turned to Principal Dawson. "Buy us time." Dawson nodded and strode out of the restroom, walking straight toward the couple as they entered the school lobby. Mrs. Carter took one last glance at the back door where Madison and Mrs. Holloway had disappeared, then forced herself to walk calmly down the hallway, heading in the opposite direction, toward the main office where security cameras were recording everything. She needed evidence. She slipped into the office, her hands moving quickly over the computer keyboard. Years of working late nights had given her enough familiarity with the school's security system. She pulled up the footage from the parking lot and hit record, saving the last few minutes of video onto a flash drive. The way Madison's parents moved, their calm, their precision, it wasn't normal. It wasn't parental concern. It was business. A sudden commotion outside made her freeze. Then, "Where is she?" Madison's father's voice, cold and sharp. Mrs. Carter pocketed the flash drive and stepped back into the hallway. From a distance, she saw Dawson blocking the couple's path. "She hasn't been to class today," he said smoothly. "If she's missing, maybe you should file a police report." Madison's mother tilted her head, lips pressing into a thin smile. "That won't be necessary," she said. "We just need to check something first." She moved as if to step around Dawson, but before she could take another step, "That's far enough." A firm voice cut through the tension. Mrs. Carter turned and exhaled in relief. Detective Reynolds had arrived. He was flanked by 2 officers, his badge shining under the fluorescent lights. Madison's father stiffened. "We were just looking for our daughter," he said smoothly. Reynolds' expression didn't change. "Funny, I just got off the phone with a judge." He pulled out a folded piece of paper. "We have a warrant to search your home, your bank records, and your phone calls. See, I did a little digging on my way here. Turns out this isn't the first time a girl in your household has disappeared." Mrs. Carter's stomach dropped. Not the first time. For the first time, Madison's mother's expression flickered with something like uncertainty. But her father, his face hardened. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed. "You have no right." "We do," Reynolds interrupted, stepping closer, "because we also have a witness, your daughter. And I think, deep down, you already know. She's never coming back to you." A long, heavy silence followed. Then, without another word, Madison's father turned and placed his hands behind his back. He knew it was over. As the officers cuffed them both, Mrs. Carter felt a deep, shuddering breath escape her chest. She turned toward Reynolds. "Madison?" she asked urgently. "She's safe," Reynolds assured her. "We have her at a secure location. She and the baby will be taken care of." Tears burned behind Mrs. Carter's eyes, but she blinked them back. For the first time, Madison was free. The school hallway was buzzing with life. Students rushed past, laughter and chatter filling the air. Mrs. Carter sat at her desk, flipping through a stack of essays, when a small knock came at her door. She looked up and her breath caught. Madison stood there, looking healthier than she ever had. Her hair was longer, her cheeks fuller, her eyes brighter, and in her arms, a baby girl with chubby cheeks and curious eyes played with the strings of her hoodie. Mrs. Carter stood. Madison. Madison smiled. I wanted to see you, to say, thank you. She glanced down at the baby. This is Lily. Mrs. Carter's throat tightened. She's beautiful, she whispered. Madison took a deep breath. I'm starting college next month. The shelter helped me get a scholarship. And Lily, she's safe. We're safe. Mrs. Carter felt a tear slip down her cheek. I am so proud of you. Madison hesitated, then stepped forward and wrapped her in a hug. For the first time in years, Madison wasn't afraid. And for the first time, she had a future worth looking forward to.